everybody, Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Valorant video. And now that I put my VTech in park, we can get down to business because we have a brand new weapons tier list for patch 2.03. And with really huge weapon changes that can dramatically shift the entire meta, we gotta talk about all the changes to the list here. And we gotta break down all the good and bad weapons so that you know exactly what you need to pop off and you don't end up like a Pro Guide subscriber. Yeah, you know that channel that keeps buying ads for our videos? Yeah, that's the one. But go to the GameLeap website in the links down below for high quality exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. And our website is packed to the brim filled with content. I mean, if you look at competitors like, you know, Papega Guides, they have less content that we put out on this channel for free in any given week. You don't even have to take my word for it. Just read their comment section and you'll know. Oh wait, they delete them. Oh, whatever. Anyways, do yourself a favor, go check it out in the links down below if you actually want to improve. With all that being said, let's just jump right into the video. Now, of course, we gotta talk about the changes very quickly. I'm not gonna break them down in detail. You can check that out in our patch video, but for reference, the Frenzy got a price nerf, the Stinger got a price nerf, and a damage nerf, not to mention a recoil nerf, making it a lot more difficult to control, and the Marshal got a gigantic buff with a price buff, a scope change buff where it's more zoomed in, and you can peek a lot faster while zoomed in with a zoomed movement buff. Altogether, these are the big movers, and of course, coupled with the agent changes, the new ranked weapons tier list is going to be a lot different than it used to be. So let's kick it off with the S tier. Now, the big movers in the S tier are the Stinger and the Frenzy that are freaking kicked out of the S tier. That's right, they are no longer going to be the dominant weapons in the meta. Thank the freaking GameLeap gods. But this actually means two very important things. First off, force buying isn't going to be as powerful because the Stinger was the go-to in forces, and with it weaker, even though it's still not terrible, it's still decent, it's not going to be so overpowered that it's going to create this force buy meta where the first 5 rounds of the game are just always force buys. That's what it felt like anyways for high level rank play. Now, on top of that, because the Frenzy is no longer able to be bought with armor, there are so many more options, and a lot of the power level of the Frenzy has been diminished, and this really opens up a lot of other weapons to be viable on that pistol round, where the Frenzy was just the de facto best weapon to go to, and that's also amazing. So you can see how these two changes can really allow other guns to thrive in those eco rounds that didn't thrive before, and also allows other starter weapons to be viable that weren't viable before because the Frenzy just overshadowed them. Now, before we get into all that, we gotta talk about the top of the S tier, which is of course the Vandal versus the Phantom, which is a debate that we've been having back and forth non-stop, and basically it's still the same. Nothing has changed about these two weapons. The Vandal is better at taking duels. The Phantom is better for many other things like recoil control, shooting through smokes, fighting from closer effective ranges. There's a lot of things that the Phantom can do better in team-based play, and that's why with coordination it's typically better, and in pro play it's typically better, but in the very fraggy solo carry-esque landscape of ranked, the Vandal can get a lot of value just being that de facto click heads gun, win a duel gun, aggressively take a challenge gun. But one thing that you should note is that the Vandal was incredibly good in the hands of Reyna, who received a gigantic nerf, and that's going to be a mark against the gun's overall pick rate. But realistically, pick the Vandal, pick the Phantom. You can still climb all the way to the highest ranks with either one, even just one tricking one of them. So it doesn't ultimately matter that much in the end. It's really up to your own personal preference. And of course, you never have to just pick one. You can always switch it up depending on where you're playing, how you're holding, and what you plan on doing with the gun. Now, the next weapon in the S tier is actually the classic pistol, risen from the ashes. Don't we all remember just how broken the classic pistol is? Oh, we forgot because of the Frenzy? Well, the classic pistol's still freaking nuts, and now it's back on top. Amazing weapon, and you're gonna see a lot more classic pistol with Ghost buying on that first pistol round because it's the only weapon besides the Shorty, which is just not viable on that pistol round, that you're gonna actually see with armor. So classic pistol is just gonna be amazing. It's already an amazing weapon, just having it as a secondary that can one-shot a fully armored target, but being able to use it with armor in that pistol round is most likely going to be the way that the meta is going to form post Frenzy nerf. And then the last weapon in the S tier is the Operator, still amazing and actually looking to be better going forward. And the reason is Operator is better in a landscape where people are forcing a lot less. When a weapon like a Stinger is so powerful, it just becomes really worth the risk to invest in a gun like that. But as it becomes more expensive and weaker, it's not always worth that investment, which basically creates a lot more save-based rounds. And in that environment, when people are saving for rifles, the operator is a way to go over the top of that type of play. When you're going up against that forced buy meta, you got to think about teams love to find a pick and rush a site incredibly quickly. There's a lot of very quick executes, and if you're not set up in the appropriate place with that operator, you're not going to get value, and it's going to be very hard for you to retake with that operator. But now, in a much more safe-oriented meta, post-Stinger, like I said, Stinger's still going to be good. It's not going to be gone, but there's going to be less forcing overall. There's going to be less 5 buying Stingers every single round. So overall, the operator is going to be even better than it has been in the last meta, and that's very important. You haven't learned the operator, definitely learn it. And of course, with Reyna kind of dethroned from that top solo carry spot, Jett is taking her spot. So Jett plus operator is looking to be really prime, and plus you could still abuse things like the Bucky, which hasn't gotten any nerfs. So overall, that is probably where you want to be if you're looking for a weapon character combo to carry in the new meta. Now moving on to the A tier, these are weapons that are going to be incredibly good in the new meta, but of course they're not going to be absolute staples. They're just going to be weapons that are going to see a large amount of play consistently. Now at the top of the A tier is actually the Ghost Pistol, and if you remember, our previous tier list had the Ghost Pistol pretty low. I believe it was all the way in C tier, but remember that Frenzy can no longer buy armor, and that was the problem with the Ghost Pistol before. When Frenzy users bought armor and they got rushed, you hit the headshot, you still lose the duel. That is absolutely unacceptable. If you're holding an angle, you get rushed on by a Frenzy and you just die for free, and then you give someone, some secondary person, that Ghost and they have armor. It's just absolutely terrible, and overall Ghost didn't work very well in that environment. However, now that the Frenzy users, if they are any left, which personally I don't think the Frenzy will see that much play after the dust settles, but Ghosts are going to be able to one-tap headshot them, which is going to be nice. And that classic pistol, not quite as good at running you down consistently as the Frenzy was. And that's just a mark in the positive for the Ghost, and it's looking like the Ghost is going to be back for pistol rounds, which is pretty good because it actually requires aim, unlike the freaking Frenzy. And I know you might get mad at me about that, but I abused the hell out of the Frenzy, so what can I say about it? But moving on to the next weapon that is in the A tier, we are talking about the Sheriff. Now, the Sheriff also gets better, actually, with the nerf of the Stinger, because the Stinger often would just be a better choice than the Sheriff. People would want to buy that Sheriff, and they'll just say, hey, why wouldn't I just get the Stinger for about the same price tag? And the Stinger is going to be very consistent value, and it doesn't require aim. But remember, less forces means less people just psycho rushing you down, and Sheriff was not good up against Stingers that just chased you down like crazy, ran and gunned you. That is very hard for a Sheriff to fight that. Sheriff is actually better at fighting against very disciplined counter-strafe peaks like Vandals and Phantoms and even Operators or Marshals or whatever. So Sheriff is actually better now because it's a better option than the Stinger now because the Stinger's worse, and it's just gonna be better in the way that the meta is changing. So twofold, definitely do yourself a favor, practice the Ghost Pistol and the Sheriff, or you're gonna have a really hard time in the future meta. So definitely keep that in mind. These are the two weapons that I think you need to put a lot of effort into practicing. Make sure that you're confident in both of these guns. Then we go to the next weapon that we have in the A tier. It's actually the Spectre. Now the Spectre is a weapon that has been overshadowed by the Stinger. That's just as simple as it gets, but now the Spectre can finally see her time of day. And now that it's not just clear cut that you should be buying a Stinger over a Spectre every time, the Spectre is going to be a really good weapon to buy. If you won that first round, you want to buy up, you buy the Spectre. The enemy is going to save. You're going to definitively win that duel or win that round with eco frags because the Spectre is very consistent at getting those eco frags. And then that third round, when the enemy buy rifles, you can abuse the running and gunning aspect of the Spectre to try to get an edge in some regard. And overall, the Spectre's probably going to be very, very solid of a gun. But the more interesting weapon that I have at the bottom of A tier is actually the Marshall. And I talked about all the dramatic changes to the Marshall at the beginning of the video, but the Marshall is looking actually really, really nuts. You don't even need to hit that headshot if enemies are not force buying up, and that's gonna happen a lot less. Remember, we said the incentives to force buy up when you lose is a lot less than it used to be because the power level of the Stinger is not as high as it used to be. And in that regard, Marshall can be a freaking free defensive side. If the enemy doesn't buy armor, you're rocking that Marshall and you have that freaking movement scope speed, you can quick scope all these motherfuckers around the map and just get kill after kill after kill with the Marshall, and it can just be completely overpowered if the enemy decides to save. Now on top of that, because of the amplified zoom and the ability for you to Ferrari peek with this damn scope, it's actually a pretty decent counter to operators. It can actually contest Vandals and Phantoms, especially if you put in the time and effort to getting good with the Marshall. It can be one of those weapons that really give you the X factor to clutch up an entire round, and I imagine that there are going to be some people that get amazing at the Marshall, and being good at the Marshall alone can actually be the entire difference between winning and losing a game. Because imagine if there's just an operator that's farming your team and you just take them out with the Marshall. You get a couple kills with that Marshall in one round and the economy completely shifts in your favor. It's just freaking a phenomenal weapon. Definitely practice this weapon as well as the pistols that I talked about previously. Then we're going to the B tier. These are weapons that are still very good, but they have their place in certain scenarios. Like they're tool-based weapons, they're not general purpose. And the three that we have in this tier are the Stinger, the Bulldog, the Bucky. Yes, the Stinger did receive some big nerfs, but it's still very good. It's still gonna burst you down if it's close. It can still run and gun, and it's just not going to be as easy to use at those mid ranges, and even that ADS is going to be a lot less consistent, and of course it does less damage, so you're going to lose more duels on average to guns like rifles if you don't get the drop on them, and you're not going to just absolutely beam people when you really shouldn't have been able to win a duel, but you did on the Stinger. I know you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now that doesn't mean that the Stinger isn't a viable use depending on the character you are. Like if you're someone like Jet, for instance, and you want to dash very aggressively on a forced round, you can definitely catch off an enemy, and it doesn't really matter that the Stinger doesn't have an amazingly fast time to kill, because it's more about just having high burst damage and getting the enemy in a bad timing based scenario by dashing when they're trying to set up an ability or something like that. And of course, Stinger is just still going to be great for rushing, so if you're trying to do a rush play with Brimstone, an ultimate, whatever, Stinger's probably going to still be your best bet, especially because it's quite a bit cheaper than the Spectre, and sometimes you need to buy some abilities, or you would rather buy armor, especially if you're just going to be rushing in with your entire team, rather than, of course, buying that Spectre, getting light armor or no abilities. It's probably better to get the former. Now, the Bulldog is actually going to be quite a bit better now because of the Stinger's nerf, and just like we talked about before, the way the meta is moving means that when you force on that second round, after you win, of course, you want a gun that's going to scale better up against rifles because the enemy is more likely to save rather than force buy up to Stingers. So you win that first round, that second round you can buy that Bulldog. You want to buy that Bulldog because it's going to scale far better in that third round when the enemy buys rifles as opposed to something like a Spectre. Now the Spectre's still good, don't get me wrong, but you got to understand that the Bulldog is going to be much better in that environment rather than up against forced buys all the time with Stingers and things like that. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the Bucky, of course, Bucky's amazing. We all know just how amazing the Bucky can be. The big tactic that a lot of people are using with the Bucky is holding at the appropriate angle to get that one shot and then punishing enemies that do. The problem with the Bucky, however, is sometimes you're just holding that angle and you don't get a lot of value, and it can be pretty hit or miss of a weapon depending on who you're up against, and it can also be pretty tricky to use if you're not a freaking god like Corky. Now that being said, you might freak out that I put this underneath the Stinger, but honestly, it's not quite sure at this current moment which one of these weapons is going to actually be put on top. It was clear before that Stinger was just better most of the time compared to the Bucky, but now I don't think that that is true, and I do think that the Bucky has its specific weaknesses and strengths. It's far better at holding angles rather than it is rushing with the team, and the Stinger can abuse joint rushes and running and gunning far better, so overall, they both have have their own separate placeholders in the current meta or the future meta. Now, moving on to the C tier, we have 3 weapons: the Judge, the Frenzy, and the Ares. Now, the Judge is a weapon that can be very powerful, but it's only really viable on defense, and it's one of those guns that enemies need to make a vital mistake. They need to not clear you out of smokes, and if you can set it up, it could just absolutely decimate enemies. So it really kind of depends on how you use it, when you use it, but most of the time there are going to be better guns that you can buy that are just going to be a little bit more consistent or cheaper, or you could just save altogether. Now, the Frenzy is going to be a weapon relegated to the C tier. Not terrible, but it's not going to see an insane amount of play. It's going to see play here or there. But without Reyna being able to abuse it to the same extent that she did before, and without people being able to use it with armor, Frenzy is going to see a dramatic drop in pick rate. Now, I still think it's an amazing weapon as a secondary. You got some extra free money laying around, you know, on that final round or that OT round or whatever. Frenzy is an amazing secondary. It's also great to pair with an operator because it's one of the few guns that can run and gun and easily finish off an enemy if you leg them, for instance. So the Frenzy does have its places, but it's not going to be meta defining anymore, and I think that for the most of us, we're pretty happy about that. And then the last up is the Ares, a weapon that is good in some situations, but the whole wallbang stick is something that is very difficult to get value out of these days when people are just very consistent at playing around it. Not to mention, ultimately, LMGs don't scale very well because once you get to a certain rank, players can really simply headshot any LMG user that is crouch spraying. And yes, there are going to be certain maps where you can abuse it on defense through breakable walls with Sova, but other than that, these guns are not very viable. Now, let's talk about the D tier. These are weapons that just miss the mark on viability. There are either better options or they just don't get that much consistent value in general. Now, the first one's the Odin. Some people are going to disagree with me on this one, but when you're buying an Odin, there are better options. You could save up a little bit more, get that operator, or you could just buy a freaking rifle. Odin, same thing with the Ares, but at least with the Ares, you're buying it for cheap. With the Odin, you're spending a fat chunk of change for not that much better of a result, and it's still very, very niche in its use. It's a weapon that is going to work far better in the lower ranks where you don't get punished by getting headshot instantly, but in the higher ranks, you're going to die instantly the second you start spraying with the Odin. The time to kill is just not fast enough. Now, the Shorty is another weapon that is in the D tier. It can be good if you manage to cheese out a kill, but it almost never will be able to get multi-kills. And really, if you compare it directly to the classic pistol, most of the time, you just want to have the classic pistol anyways instead of the Shorty. Now, the Shorty is cheap. If you can cheese out a kill with it, if you can hide in some really close angle and catch an enemy off guard, maybe it could be worth it, but you're honestly going to be better off with another gun most of the time. And then the last weapon in D tier is the Guardian, a weapon that doesn't quite have a right identity. Honestly, at this stage of the game, I would much rather be rocking a Sheriff or now a Marshal than a Guardian, and these are like at half the cost almost. The Guardian is just going to be really inferior up against a lot of the rifles, and overall, it's just not an amazing gun. Yes, you could buy it if it's all you can afford, but really, there's going to be better options available to you. But if you don't agree with me, let me know in the comments down below, and go to the GameLeap website for everything that you possibly need to climb the ranks of Valorant with ease. We got in-depth advanced guides, VOD reviews, tips and tricks, and so much on the GameLeap website. Do yourself a favor and don't miss out on our special 50% off sale in the links down below. But thank you so much for coming by. I hope you enjoyed the video. That's all I got for you today. I'm Coach Mills. I love your faces, and I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.